What if we could just start over? In the middle of the 20th century, humanity got that opportunity. After millennia of conflict here on Earth, we turned our eyes to space. And we asked, what if this time things were different? What if cooperation could replace competition? What if hope could replace fear? What if peace could replace war? It's a beautiful dream that not everyone shares. What's humanity's legacy in outer space? On the one hand, intense superpower competition. And on the other, a lot of chilled out hippie stuff. It's pretty weird. We should explain. When we think of the space race, we usually think of it against the backdrop of the Cold War, the US and the Soviet Union in an epic struggle for supremacy. Yet in 1967, near the height of that conflict, both nations signed on to an international agreement known as the Outer Space Treaty, which does not read very Cold War-y. The Outer Space Treaty pledged the countries who signed it to use outer space for the benefit of all countries, and to regard it as the province of all mankind. It pledged that space would be used exclusively for peaceful purposes. It even referred to astronauts as envoys of mankind. In other words, if this document had been any more 60s, you'd be able to smell the incense. Now, to be fair, this wasn't all hopeless idealism. Subsequent years really have brought remarkable instances of international cooperation in outer space. American astronauts and Russian cosmonauts worked together as colleagues on the International Space Station, for example, even in moments of extreme tensions between their countries. On the other hand, the idea that a new frontier was going to make humanity more peaceful is not exactly supported by the historical record. We had barely learned to sail before we started engaging in naval battles. It only took a decade after the Wright brothers' first flight before we were engaging in aerial combat. When forest rangers came up with an innovative new method for marking trees in the 60s, it only took a few years for a couple of dudes to use the technology to shoot each other. Yes, that's really how we got paintball. Because humans basically innovate in two stages. First, hey, this new thing is cool. Second, how can we break stuff with it? As a result, ever since humans first ventured beyond our planet, there's been a debate about whether we should militarize space, whether we should allow it to become another battlefield between rival nations, or preserve it as a special zone of peace. And here's the thing about this debate that often goes overlooked. It's over. Like really, really over. Because in reality, we militarized space a long time ago. Sure, we don't have star cruisers blasting each other yet. We assume because the insurance would be too much of a headache. But space is already central to modern conflicts. Here's what we mean. Scholars and government officials often say that space is militarized but not weaponized. What that means, in plain English, is that the world's most powerful militaries usually don't make things go boom in space, but they do use space to make things go boom on Earth. And this has been going on for a while. In fact, the first conflict heavily shaped by space was arguably 1991's Persian Gulf War, in which the American military used satellites to help intercept Iraqi missiles, destroy enemy units, and relay more than 90% of battlefield communications. And in the decade since, satellites have only become more central to military power. Today, it's estimated that around 30 nations have military satellites, with the US, China, and Russia having by far the most. And 12 of those countries have or are developing counterspace capabilities, which allow them to attack other countries' hardware in space. Although one of those countries is the UK, in whose case we suspect attack, just means ask very politely. And all that technology in outer space is constantly shaping conflict here on Earth. In recent years, there's been a huge surge in countries jamming GPS signals to weaken their adversaries' targeting systems. That technique has been used by nations as varied as Russia, Israel, Myanmar, and North Korea, and its impact hasn't been limited to the battlefield. At one point in 2024, these military methods were also disrupting the navigation systems of 3,000 commercial flights a day. In early 2022, hacked satellites led to tens of thousands of modem outages across Europe. And by sheer coincidence, we're not going to point fingers, you can draw your own conclusions, that happened the same day Russia invaded Ukraine. From an American perspective, however, one country looms larger than any other: China. A declassified 2021 report from the Director of National Intelligence declared that China is making steady progress in its goal of overtaking the US as the world's leading space power within the next 20 years. Why is that cause for concern? Between 2018 and 2024, China tripled its military satellite systems. Military officials report that Beijing is developing new systems capable of attacking US satellites with missiles, lasers, and even space robots. And in 2025, a senior leader in the US Space Force noted that we've observed Chinese satellites practicing maneuvers so aggressive that he referred to them as the outer space equivalent of dogfighting, which is a problem for the US because Tom Cruise is getting too old to bring out of retirement. And as unnerving as all of that is, the future of space warfare could be even more menacing. Because if we eventually do get to a place where things start going boom in space, well, we're in a whole new world. National security officials have warned that Russia is developing a nuclear weapon for use in space that could set off a chain reaction capable of destroying nearly every single satellite in low Earth orbit. It's estimated that the resulting damage could leave that part of space unusable for up to a year. And given how dependent we are on satellites, which are involved in everything from navigation to banking to weather forecasts, the power to take out satellites is the power to grind modern society to a halt. There's even military research into an idea that literally started out in science fiction, dropping massive heavy metal rods from orbit where they would fall with such speed that they'd create an explosion that'd be like a nuclear weapon without the fallout, a technology sometimes referred to as rods from God, though we're pretty confident the Almighty would not love that branding. But here's the irony of this whole situation. At this point, the most likely way to keep the peace in space is probably to continue militarizing it. Many foreign policy scholars argue that the key to keeping other countries from using their space weapons is deterrence, having our own weapons, and convincing our adversaries that we'll use them if threatened, making the cost of an attack too high. Is it the high-minded idealism of the Outer Space Treaty? Not exactly, but in the world we actually live in, the one where our adversaries won't think twice about any of this, it might just be our most realistic shot at keeping the peace, at assuring that space really does remain open to all nations, and at keeping that poor British satellite safe.